On April 27th, 1889, the morning thermometer nailed outside Kincaid Mercantile read 43 degrees at dawn and 68 by mid-afternoon. Yet the river below Copper Creek ran with a color too dark for spring and a surface too smooth for honest meltwater. The settlement held 347 souls by the church census, clustered between the sandstone escarpment and the narrow bend of current that had always seemed manageable to men who had not watched a hard river turn. Teamsters watched the channel while loading ore sacks for the next wagon train and said the quiet run meant an easy season. Older miners who had seen one hard freshet in Wyoming Territory and two lesser surges near Elkhorn said little and spat into the dust. Above them all, where the cliff wall took afternoon sun and gave back heat after dusk, Hank Reynolds measured the stone with a carpenter rule, a chalk line, and a length of hemp rope marked in feet by knots burned dark with lampblack. Hank had arrived in Copper Creek 11 months earlier with a sorrel mare, 2 iron kettles, a chest of linen thread soaked in pine tar, and a habit of studying runoff channels before he asked about wages. He was 34 years old, broad through the shoulders, marked by old rope burns across both palms, with a healed split at the base of his left thumb from icework in his youth. He spoke in short statements, paid in coin when he had it, and accepted day labor where he could find it. Hauling timbers, setting fence posts, shoring adits at the lower mine. He rented a narrow room behind the cooper shop for $4 each month and ate plainly, keeping account lines in a pocket ledger with dates, costs, and weather notes written in a tight, upright hand. Those who knew only his silence called him severe. Those who watched him work called him exact. Neither judgment reached the center of him because the center had been formed far from Colorado by water that could rise in darkness and carry away a winter's certainty in one night. He was born in a floodplain valley near Oulu, where spring breakup came with ice rot, rain, and long channels that crossed meadow ground like braided wire. His grandfather, Eero Lettinen, had been a boatman and net mender who measured danger by debris height on alder trunks, not by calendar optimism. His mother, Aino Reynolds, after her marriage to an English rail hand, kept grain through wet years by waxing sackcloth and sealing seams so flour could survive cellar damp when barrels failed. In the spring of 1878, when Hank was still a young man, Eero tied off a skiff to fetch 2 neighbors from a cutbank house and did not return before the midnight surge. They found the skiff 3 miles downstream, caught in willow roots with 1 broken oar still lashed in place. Aino never romanticized that death. She said only that water rewards no pride, and that preparation is a form of duty owed to those who sleep while weather changes. The chain of teaching passed in practical units. Render beeswax with a measure of tallow so the coating remains flexible in cold. Warm the sacks before brushing, or wax will flake. Stitch every seam twice with tarred linen, then hold each line before a lamp to check for pinholes. Store food where groundwater cannot breathe on it. If a river runs too smooth after deep snow, count that calm as warning, not mercy. By the time Hank crossed into Colorado territory, those instructions had become muscle memory. He could judge cloth weight by touch, identify sour flour by scent through canvas, and calculate how much salt pork a household of 5 required for 10 winter weeks if supplemented by beans and dried fruit. In Copper Creek, from what he heard at the mercantile counter and outside the assay office, that kind of caution carried less standing than visible risk. Men praised extraction, trade, and display. Preventive labor was treated as fearful temperament. The hierarchy had a public face in Asa Kincaid, proprietor of Kincaid Mercantile, whose building stood on Main Street with a false front, painted cream and green, 2 broad windows and a brass scale polished each Saturday. Asa was 41, well-fed, precise in dress, with watch chain and pressed vest, even in mud season. and he understood credit networks better than any man within 40 miles. He extended loans in seed and lamp oil, held liens quietly until collection, and believed that order in a town depended on commerce appearing stronger than hazard. He had prospered through 2 lean winters and a rail delay, and prosperity gave his judgments weight that often exceeded their merit. When Hank asked about leasing cliff land west of the church path, Asa laughed without malice at first, assuming the newcomer wanted a goat pen or a lookout perch. The strip measured only 38 feet across at the base, narrowing to broken shelves too steep for wagon access and too shallow for planning. No one had claimed it because it seemed to offer nothing that could be sold quickly. Hank paid $9 cash through the clerk at the recorder table, signed in a clear hand, and took possession by noon. He began the next morning with survey stakes and a plumb bob made from scrap lead. The first mark was set 32 feet above the usual spring line, determined from older flood scars and corrected by his own readings of recent drift tangles. From that line, he measured chamber heights, ladder angles, and sling points for hoisting barrels. He bought a short roll of heavy canvas, a small keg of cut nails, a bundle of cedar slats from the saw pit, and 3 new brush heads for wax application. He bartered for beeswax from 2 apiary keepers upstream and rendered it with tallow in a cast kettle over low coals until the mixture ran clear, amber, and left no grain at the rim. By the first week of May, the cliff face carried the geometry of intent. 3 chambers were cut and squared, each 8 feet deep, 5 feet wide, 7 feet high. He lined the floors with cedar slats raised on stone nubs so air could travel under every sack. He cut drainage channels 1 hand wide, angled to spill seepage toward an outer lip away from provisions. He set ladder rungs of seasoned oak into drilled sockets and pegged them with iron pins to resist swelling. At dusk, he tested every rung with his full weight, and then with 200 pounds of sandbag load to simulate a barrel swing in rain. He worked without audience in the hours when miners took supper, but he could feel eyes gather whenever hammer blows echoed off the wall. Children paused on the church path to watch him brush warm wax over coarse grain sacks until cloth darkened and stiffened, then softened as the blend settled. Women collecting water noted the second seam line sewn by hand in tarred thread, close and even as boot stitching. Teamsters at the hitching rail said he handled flour as though it were mining powder. By Saturday, the talk reached Kincaid's counter in full shape. Asa waited until the store was crowded, then spoke loud enough for those at the bolt cloth table and the kerosene cask to hear. "Reynolds Folly," he said, tapping his ledger with 1 finger. "Only a frightened foreigner would hide food in a cliff like a badger when respectable sellers stand ready on proper ground." Laughter followed, some uneasy, some eager. A younger clerk repeated the line at the door. By evening, boys had turned it into a chant near the pump. "Reynolds waxes sacks like a washerwoman." Hank did not answer in the street. He carried 2 waxed flour sacks up the ladder, set them in the rear chamber, and sealed the plank door with a clay bead pressed tight along the frame. The next day, he stacked beans in 3-tier runs, salt pork in wrapped crocks, and dried apples in hanging net bags to keep mice from chewing through canvas. He recorded each item by weight and date. Flour, 50-pound sacks, 24 units. Beans, 30-pound sacks, 16. Salt pork, 18-pound crocks, 9. Dried apples, 12-pound nets, 11. Lamp oil in capped tins. Medicine alcohol in 2 glass demijohns wrapped with straw rope. He left aisle gaps of 14 inches for movement in darkness and marked shelf edges with lime wash so lantern light would catch quickly if smoke thickened. Near sunset on May 9th, while tightening a rope sling around a pork barrel, he was approached by Caleb Morrow, a stable hand hardly older than 17, who had repeated Kincaid's joke 2 days prior and now stood with cap in both hands. Caleb asked in a strained quiet, Why a man would choose ridicule over ease when ground cellars could be dug in half the time. Hank set the knot, checked the knot again, and gave the only explanation he offered that spring. "Words do not stop water," he said. "A wall of current does not bargain with pride." Then he nodded toward the river bend, where willow roots already held twigs and bark higher than they should have held in early season. Caleb followed his gaze, said nothing, and carried the next sack up the ladder without being asked. By the evening of May 10th, the chambers were not full but disciplined. The seals held. The ledger matched the shelves. The clay joints dried hard as brick. From the ledge he watched ore carts, Sunday coats, and credit tallies continue below, while he finished waxing the last of that week's grain and set his palm flat against the cooling plank door, as though taking an oath before stone. Below him, the river moved in the failing light with a composure that made careful men uneasy, and by the time the church bell struck 8 that night, the thermometer had dropped to 49 degrees, though the air held a wet softness, more fitting for June than early mountain spring. Hank remained on the ledge until dark settled into the bend, watching loose bark and snapped reed stems sweep past in narrow lines that did not match the current's apparent speed. He climbed down by lantern, checked the kettle one last time, and covered the remaining wax with a fitted tin lid so ash would not spoil the blend by morning. Rain began before dawn on May 11th, first as a fine mist that grayed the bluff, then as a sustained fall that struck roofs in steady percussion and turned every wagon rut in Main Street to standing water by mid-morning. At 6 o'clock, the mercantile thermometer read 54. At noon, it read 58. The heat was the wrong kind of heat, the kind that unlocked high snow too quickly and sent whole hillsides downward through channels too narrow to hold them. Hank was on the church steps by 10, hat dripping, coat darkened to near black, speaking to anyone willing to stand in the rain long enough to hear him. He said the snowpack above the basin had stood near 9 feet in some draws through March. He said warm rain on deep late snow did not make a spring rise. It made a break. He asked each household to move seed grain, lamp oil, blankets, and children's winter boots above 20 feet, and to keep ropes cut and ready by each door. The request was practical and spare. It landed badly. Asa Kincaid stepped from his wagon with an umbrella held by one clerk and answered from the foot of the steps in a voice trained for counters and credit disputes. Panic, he said, would do greater damage than weather. Trade depended on confidence, and confidence depended on reason. He added, for all to hear, that Copper Creek had survived freshets before, and would survive this one as well if men kept their heads and their purchases regular. Several nodded, less from conviction than from habit. Commerce had a language they understood. Water still seemed abstract. That afternoon, Kincaid sold 7 extra barrels, 12 coil lengths of rope, and 24 lamp tins to households that stored all of it at floor level. Hank bought quietly from the same counter, 40 yards of heavy canvas at 20 cents per yard, 6 kegs of cut nails, and 2 iron hasp blocks with long throw bars, suitable for swollen doors. Asa counted the coin and did not offer credit. When Hank asked for 2 additional sacks of coarse salt, Asa said those would be reserved for long-standing accounts. Hank accepted the refusal without argument, loaded his purchases, and hauled them up the church path by mule drag, one trip at a time. The rain held for 3 days. By May 13th, water threaded along both sides of Main Street and entered lower cellars in finger-width sheets that many called nuisance seepage. Hank called it instruction. He opened each chamber door, checked every wax seam by lantern, and found 2 sacks where brushing had thinned near the folded corners. He rewarmed the wax blend to 140 degrees by his thermometer strip, recoated both sacks, and stitched reinforcing corners with tarred linen in cross passes. He laid fresh cedar slats under the bean tier to improve airflow, and reset one plank threshold that had lifted half an inch from moisture expansion. He moved faster than usual, though none who watched him could claim he rushed. On May 14th, the railroad agent nailed a telegram to the postboard beside the assay office. Washed culvert near Granite Falls. Line delayed until inspection. Freight uncertain. Men read it twice, then argued over the meaning. Some said one culvert did not stop a line. Some said the operator exaggerated to secure repair crews. Hank read it once, then walked to Kincaid Mercantile and purchased 2 more shovels, a hand auger, and all remaining pine tar in stock. He paid $3.71. By lamplight, he drilled new anchor points in the cliff face and set eye bolts in lead poured hot to fix them against pullout. 3 days passed before the first Eastern freight wagon failed to arrive, and that absence did more to sober Copper Creek than any warning spoken in rain. On May 16th, the team from Black Fork did not appear by dusk. On May 17th, a rider came instead, mud to his stirrups, reporting the supply bridge closed by current and debris impact. No crossing expected before assessment. The town had been living off the assumption of replenishment. That assumption ended in a single sentence spoken near the pump. By the 3rd week of May, Hank shifted from stocking to fortifying. He extended a narrow 4-chamber on the upper shelf, 6 feet deep and 4 feet across, meant not for long storage but for rapid distribution during storm conditions when the main doors needed to remain sealed. He fitted cedar rails at shoulder height for hanging wet coats, so interior moisture could drain outward rather than settle on flour sacks. He built a clay-lined stove niche into the lee side, vented through a bent iron flue that discharged above the ledge where downdrafts were weakest. He carved notches into the ladder side rails at 1-foot intervals so climbers could judge progress in darkness by touch alone. Kincaid escalated in equal measure. He refused Hank any form of store credit in public terms, then raised staple prices nearly double under the language of scarcity risk. Flour that had sold for $2.10 a sack rose to $3.90. Beans rose from $1.20 to $2.10. Lamp oil rose from 30 cents per tin to 55. At the hitching rail, he repeated the line that had already spread through town, adding a refinement meant to sting. Reynolds waxes sacks like a washerwoman. Because he has no head for honest commerce, men laughed with their mouths and looked away with their eyes. The line passed from rail to pump to schoolyard. Children shouted it along the church path when Hank hauled canvas rolls uphill. A few women corrected them. Most did not. Social cruelty in small settlements often wore the face of ordinary repetition. Hank continued to measure, seal, and record. Caleb Morrow began showing up after stable hours to carry loads and hold lanterns. He was not paid in coin. He was taught why sacks were never stacked, flush against stone, why salt pork crocks were wrapped in oiled cloth before storage, why each door required both hasp and clay bead, lock for hands and clay for water. Near the end of May, geese lifted from the lower marsh 2 weeks earlier than local memory held, and muskrats rebuilt dens on banks above the old willow line. Hank pointed once toward those signs while crossing Main Street with a coil of rope over his shoulder. No one argued with him directly. Silence had replaced mockery in some faces, which wasn't agreement but a first fracture in certainty. Then came a week of bright weather in early June, clear mornings and mild afternoons, and the town's confidence returned as quickly as it had faltered. Men reopened cellar vents to dry beams. Families brought rugs outside. Kincaid moved dry goods to front display and spoke of overreaction as a passing fever. On June 7th, he offered discounted lamp wicks from a barrel by the door and told customers that prudent commerce had steadied the town. The river dropped 4 inches at the lower gauge and looked manageable again. False calm is often more dangerous than panic, because it restores old habits before danger has finished assembling itself upstream. Hank did not alter his pace. Each dawn he checked cottonwood trunks at the bend and found fresh silt lines above marks from the day before, thin as thread but climbing. He moved his final reserves to the highest chamber. Seed corn in waxed pouches, 2 additional demijohns of medicine alcohol wrapped in straw rope, dried onion strings, and a crate of boiled bandages sealed in oilcloth. He marked household ration tables in his ledger by family size, reducing each line to numbers any helper could follow if he was absent. 3 souls, 7 pounds flour per week. 5 souls, 11. 8 souls, 18 with bean supplement. On June 14th, shortly after 2 in the afternoon, a driftwood mass struck the upstream trestle where the channel narrowed and lodged hard across 2 pilings. Witnesses later described the sound as a long cracking roll, timber against timber, followed by a deep thud that carried through the ground. Within an hour, the backed water rose visibly against bank grass. By dusk, it had climbed 6 feet at the bend and pushed cold eddies through cellar windows along Main Street. What had seemed a river became a held reservoir. At sundown, Ruth Bell climbed to Hank's ledge with her skirts soaked to the knee and her father's livery ledger wrapped in canvas against her chest. She was 11 years old, narrow-shouldered, breathing hard from the ascent, and she asked one direct question after she caught her breath. If the jam broke in the night, where should her family go? And how would they reach it if the street disappeared first? The question mattered because it was public in spirit, even though asked in private. Pride had sent a child where adults had refused to go. Hank took the ledger from her, set it under a dry cloth, and walked her to the outer edge of the ledge where the line of the church bell frame was visible through rain haze. He pointed to each potential anchor in order: cliff bolts, bell frame, cooper shed post, blacksmith yard gate. He explained distances in 20-yard intervals and the meaning of each knot cluster he would tie into the main rope by midnight. 1 knot meant hold position. 2 meant move uphill. 3 meant cut loose from fixed points and shift to handline travel only. Ruth repeated each instruction once and did not miss a word. Through that night, he worked with Caleb and 2 miners who had finally come without jokes. They ran the first lifeline from upper bolts to the church frame and tensioned it with wagon turnbuckles scavenged from ore rigs. They wrapped lantern chimneys in strips of red cloth and hung them at safe ascent points where floodwater would not extinguish the flame too quickly. They set spare rope coils in tarred tubs, placed axes at each anchor in case lines needed cutting under load, and chalked directional arrows on stone where mud would not erase them. Below, Kincaid ordered his clerks to protect store inventory first and move ledgers to the loft. He had not yet accepted what water does to foundations laid for dry years. Near midnight, Hank looked down from the ledge and saw current cutting beneath Kincaid's loading platform in steady bites, each surge taking another section of packed earth. He sent Caleb to the Bell house with one instruction for Ruth, delivered word for word and without embellishment. Bring every child you can find before sunrise. Caleb ran down the church path with the message still warm in his mouth, and Hank turned back to the ledge without watching him go, because the next hour demanded hands more than certainty. He pulled the main coil from its peg, measured 40 additional yards against the knot marks he had burned earlier in the week, and spliced a fresh length with a long braid and tar wrap that would not slip under wet strain. The rope line now reached from the upper cliff bolts to the bell frame, from the bell frame to the cooper shed post, and from there to a new anchor sunk behind the livery by auger and iron pin. He tested each segment with 3 men leaning full weight in sequence, then with a loaded ore cart hitched as dead pull. and each time he listened not to the rope, but to the hardware, to the small grinding note that meant a bolt turning in its seat. The work did not stop for weather. Rain swept sideways, then settled to a hard vertical fall, then returned sideways again as wind shifted in the draw. Hank and the two miners drove cedar stakes at ladder landings and wrapped their tops in oilcloth to keep splinters from wet hands. They widened the lowest approach shelf by 18 inches with pick and shovel, so two adults carrying a crate could pass without turning sideways. They set plank treads across the slickest section with nails clenched from below, then dusted the boards with coarse sand and ash to improve footing. By the hour before midnight, the cliff no longer resembled a solitary cache. It functioned as a planned receiving point, laid out for traffic, load transfer, and shelter under pressure. Hank opened the four-chamber and recalculated distribution by the reality in front of him, not by his ledger's earlier estimate. He set flour in 30-pound issue piles instead of 50-pound sacks, knowing tired arms drop heavy loads. He moved beans nearest the door and hung dried apples at shoulder height, where a child could hand them down without climbing. He uncorked one demijohn of medicine alcohol and poured measured portions into corked half bottles, 6 ounces each, so no one would waste time in darkness drawing from glass. He filled 2 kettles and 1 wash boiler from barrels already stored high, added salt and split onion for broth base, and stacked kindling in dry bundles wrapped with twine loops for quick lighting. Every step was method and sequence was what kept panic from becoming injury. By 1 o'clock, the first families arrived in quiet groups, not fleeing yet, but obeying instructions with the stiff posture of those who still hoped obedience would prove unnecessary. Ruth came back first with 3 younger children from the schoolhouse row, each bundled in coats too large and carrying what adults had thrust into their arms: a Bible, a loaf heel wrapped in cloth, a tin cup. Hank directed them to the second chamber and gave Ruth charge over blanket issue by simple count. "No one sleeps against stone," he said. "Keep the youngest between 2 older bodies. Rotate the dry wool every hour." She nodded once and began, her face set with the seriousness of paid work. Through the same stretch of night, Copper Creek divided along lines that had existed long before rain. Some households moved trunks, bedding, and seed to lofts and uphill sheds in disciplined relays. Others remained where they were, trusting porch height, cellar walls, and old memory. Kincaid Mercantile lit every lamp in both front windows as though brightness itself were an argument, and Asa stood under the awning calling instructions to clerks who carried crate after crate toward the rear loft ladder. He sent one boy to the church path with a demand that Hank spare 2 men to help at the store. The boy returned alone with Hank's reply. The rope line was for souls first, goods second, and any able body was welcome to pull with them at dawn. That answer became a new grievance by breakfast, and grievance in a small town traveled faster than floodwater. Men who had repeated Kincaid's old line now sharpened it. At the pump, one said Hank had seized a storm to make himself gatekeeper over honest families. At the smithy yard wall, another said the cliff had become a private fortress under public fear. Asa gave the sentiment formal shape. He declared before customers sheltering under his awning that Reynolds' method, as a few had begun calling it in wary respect, was merely Reynolds' ownership in disguise, and that no merchant should surrender order to a laborer with rope burns and foreign river tales. He announced that all who held active store credit should report to the Mercantile first for rations and instructions, not to the cliff. The declaration would have held weeks earlier. In the rain of that morning, it met the resistance of experience already unfolding. Families who reported to the store found flour high on shelves, but no safe route for moving it through rising backlots. They found clerks tired, ladders slick, and ledgers prioritized over loading paths. They found prices rewritten in pencil even now. Flour at $4.10 per sack, beans at $2.40, lamp oil at 60 cents the tin. No one shouted. No one overturned a counter. They simply left in pairs and threes and walked uphill toward the church path, where Hank had marked waiting points with chalk circles and assigned loads by strength instead of account status. Still, mockery did not vanish in one turn. It changed tone. Those who had laughed openly now spoke with narrowed mouths and resentful precision, accusing Hank of dramatizing natural runoff, then accusing him of inviting dependence, then accusing him of moving too slowly once they joined his line. One ranch hand, drenched and shaking, muttered that a man who waxed sacks by hand would count out mercy by spoonfuls. Hank heard him, handed him a shovel, and told him to deepen the drainage cut below the third ladder to 6 inches and keep grade toward the spill lip. The hand returned an hour later with mud to his chest and no further speech. Work answered what argument could not. By late afternoon on June 15th, with rain still steady and the temperature holding near 56, Hank extended the system again. He sent Caleb and miner Josiah Pike with a coil to the old assay post and ordered a secondary hand line for those crossing from east dwellings if the main street failed. He had them knot cloth flags at 10-yard intervals so distance could be judged through spray. He cut 2 rescue poles from ash saplings, each 12 feet long with iron hooks bound at one end for catching rafters or wagon rails. He set a tally board at the 4-chamber door listing households by count and issued rations against marks, not names, to prevent delay or favoritism. In less than 30 hours, the project that had begun as one man's weather discipline had become a communal logistics frame under duress. The warning signs multiplied and grew harder to deny, though denial remained a stubborn craft. Along the river bend, willow branches that should have swayed in open air were now trapped at half length by debris mats pressed flat against them. Cottonwood trunks carried fresh silt bands every dawn, each new line a thumb width above the last. Dogs refused the lower alleys and pulled hard on leashes toward higher ground. Team horses in 3 separate barns stamped and turned broadside to doors, ears fixed upstream. Muskrats crossed open yards in daylight, moving bedding grass toward the church knoll without pause. A pair of geese circled twice at noon and settled in a dry lot near the cemetery, far from their usual marsh feeding. Hank read each sign as one sentence in a document he had learned to trust before clocks and before men with ledgers. He walked bank markers at first light, carrying a measuring rod scored in inches. At the trestle watch point, he noted backwater velocity by floating chips along a corded 10-foot span and timing them against his pocket watch. The run slowed by nearly 1/3 between morning and evening, which meant obstruction tightening upstream, not release. He scraped mud from a bridge piling and found new impact scars with bark fibers still wedged in the gouges, evidence of heavier debris than the channel had passed in ordinary freshet years. He carried these observations to the church steps and spoke them plainly. If the jam held, upstream pressure would rise until side channels opened through town. If it broke, the first surge would arrive with force enough to lift frame walls from sills. Some listened and moved. Others interpreted each sign to fit their wish. The geese, they said, followed feed. The horses, they said, reacted to thunder. The silt lines, they said, reflected ordinary bankwash magnified by fear. Asa repeated that interpretation each evening beneath his awning, coat collar turned high, boots no longer polished but still carefully brushed. He argued that elevated storage was sensible for cautious homes, yet ruinous as a town principle. Because if everyone moved uphill, commerce at street level would collapse before any true flood struck. It was a narrow logic and in fair weather might have persuaded many. Under 3 days of rising water and missing freight, it persuaded fewer each hour. On June 16th, just after dawn, The railroad agent reached Copper Creek from the telegraph shack with 2 dispatch slips folded in oilskin. The first confirmed what they feared. Black Fork Bridge remained closed. No freight movement westbound. No relief wagons expected until current dropped below the survey mark. The second reported a second debris strike above Granite Falls and warned downstream settlements to clear low banks. The agent read both aloud on the church porch while rain tapped the roof in relentless measure. Hank asked for the slips, copied the key lines into his ledger, and posted the copies at the path entrance where all could see. No one called him alarmist then. By noon that same day, the river had turned from dark to opaque brown, carrying fence rails, split-barrel staves, and once, the roof of a chicken coop, moving whole as a raft until it struck a cottonwood and folded. The sound changed as well. What had been surface rush became a deep, rolling concussion underfoot, as though wagons crossed planks somewhere out of sight without pause. Hank ordered every remaining child in the lower blocks moved to the church hall and then to the ledge in groups of 4 with 2 adults each. He did not send them through open current. He sent them on fixed line, clipped by loop and guided hand to hand. As evening approached, he made one more circuit of the anchors with Caleb at his shoulder and Ruth counting lantern fuel behind them. They checked knots, retightened one turnbuckle, replaced one frayed wrap near the Cooper post, and drove a fresh wedge beside the bell frame brace where wet wood had begun to swell out of square. Hank paused only once, at the edge above Main Street, where Kincaid stood in water to his boot tops, directing clerks to stack ledgers and dry goods onto counters that now sat like islands in the dim store interior. Asa looked up and held his gaze across rain and distance, then looked away first and shouted for another crate. Night came early under the storm ceiling. Hank lit the red-marked chimneys one by one, their glow catching on rain like embers in smoke, and opened the 4-chamber doors to receive whoever climbed next. Behind him, the waxed sacks sat dry and patient in their cedar-lined rows, each seam sealed by labor that had been mocked when the ground was clear. Ahead of him, the river climbed another handspan against the measuring stake before the bell struck 8. He marked the line in chalk, closed his fingers around the wet rail, and told Caleb to wake every household still below the church before the next hour turned. Caleb took a lantern in each hand and ran downhill as ordered, moving door to door through rain and shouting names over the river's deepening roar, while Hank remained at the upper rail and watched the measuring stake until chalk bled away under spray and had to be marked again with a carpenter nail. At 9 o'clock on June 16th, the thermometer under the church eave read 53 degrees, and the river stood 14 inches below the lower bell frame brace. At 10, it had reached the brace. By 11, driftwood struck the post line hard enough to ring the iron eye bolts like dull bells. Families began climbing in uneven waves, not in orderly household groups, but in fragments assembled by urgency. A grandmother with 2 children and no coats, a miner carrying 1 trunk and then returning for his brother, a seamstress with her treadle wheel strapped to a mule that refused the lowest incline, until 3 men turned it by force. Hank stationed Josiah Pike at the first anchor and Ruth Bell at the second chamber door, and he gave each helper one command only: keep the line moving, keep hands on rope, count every soul entering shelter and every soul leaving it. The cliff path, mocked as private obsession through May, became a public artery before midnight. Just after 1 in the morning on June 17th, a tremor passed through the ground so faint that most mistook it for thunder. Hank did not. He looked upstream toward the black notch where the trestle stood and saw a brief lifting of pale spray against darkness, then a second lifting higher than the first. He sent Caleb to the bell frame with the 3-knot signal for uphill movement and ordered all remaining teams cut loose from wagons below Main Street. The command reached some stables in time. It reached others too late. In the low blocks, men still trying to stack furniture on tables found water entering at sill height and climbing with a speed that mocked all prior estimates. At 2:15, the jam shifted hard, but did not fail in full. The sound did not resemble rain, or thunder, or cannon in any clean way. It was timber grinding, stone rolling, water striking wood beams from beneath, and the long, straining report of joined things starting to pull apart. Within minutes, heavier surges drove into Copper Creek's lower street, carrying fence rails, split-roof shingles, crates and brush in fast pulses that battered foundations and filled rear lots with opaque water. The current reached the mercantile steps, piled debris against the posts, then drew back and struck again, each pass stronger than the last. The first plans that failed were the plans built for ordinary overflow. Cellar sandbags lifted and turned. Porch braces snapped at their pegs. The plank walk by the assay office rose in one long strip and folded around the pump. Men who had prepared loft storage discovered that ladders anchored to interior walls became traps when doors swelled shut and windows narrowed under debris pressure. Two families signaled from rooftop ridges with blankets tied to broom handles, while current carried hen coops against their chimneys. Hank dispatched the ash hook poles down the handline with 2 miners and directed retrieval by order of exposure, not by social standing, because water did not distinguish among surnames that had once ruled credit and wages. By 3:00, the temperature fell to 48 as cold runoff from higher draws entered the flood body, and exhaustion began to cut through the strongest volunteers. Hank shifted rotations at the rope line every 20 minutes to preserve grip strength. He had Ruth count each swap aloud and strike a nail against stone at each interval, so no one could pretend they were still steady when their hands had gone numb. He opened the second flour tier, reduced issue again to 20-pound bundles, and started broth service in tin cups passed hand to hand through the four-chamber. No cup left full. No cup returned empty. This rhythm held panic at bay as surely as iron anchors held rope. Just before dawn, the upstream jam failed in full. At dawn, with gray light breaking under low cloud, Copper Creek ceased to resemble the town counted at church census and became a scattered arrangement of roofs, upper walls, and moving wreckage. The measured rise stood 9 feet above the old spring mark on Hank's rod, and the lower mark itself had disappeared under water the color of churned clay. Kincaid Mercantile, still standing at the false front, was already hollowed from behind. Current had eaten the rear foundation in crescents through the night. When the back wall failed, barrels, bolt cloth, and account books spilled out in a single pulse and broke apart along the rope lane. Pages of Asa's ledgers, once guarded like law, floated in strips, ink running into the same water as everyone else's losses. Asa himself stood chest-deep near the loading platform, coat gone, vest clinging, one hand locked around a porch post that shifted under each strike of debris. He shouted instructions at first, then names, then one name only. Hank Reynolds. Hank Reynolds. The cry carried uphill between gusts and reached the cliff where Hank was securing a child to the handline harness. Hank did not answer immediately because the harness knot had to be checked twice before release. He finished that task, placed the child into Josiah's care, and then signaled 2 men with rescue poles to move toward the mercantile post line on the next lull between impacts. The lull never came cleanly. Rescue and moving flood was made from half seconds and bad choices corrected quickly. Elias Dunn, the blacksmith, had been working through the night at his yard gate, cutting halter lines and driving teams toward the upper slope whenever he could get a gate unbarred. When the main surge struck at dawn, 2 horses remained trapped in the collapsed side stall, their tack tangled in beam splinters and harness chains. Elias waded back against warning, chopped the chain links free with his forge hammer, and struck the rear panel loose so both animals could swim clear toward higher ground. He reached the smithy door afterward, turned, and looked once toward the anvil stand where his tool roll hung above the floodline. He went back for it, not for himself, but because rebuilding after water required steel, tongs, punches, and a man's own balanced hammer. The sidewall gave way as he braced the door. Those on the line saw him disappear in spray and timber fragments. They called his name until their throats broke. He did not surface again. 3 streets over, Marta Bell had moved children uphill before daylight and returned to the house for bedding, winter coats, and a lockbox of papers tied in oilcloth. Her neighbors shouted from a roof ridge that she had done enough. Yet she kept working in the upper room, knotting blankets to rafters so they would dry if walls held. Water rose through the stairwell faster than she judged. When she reached the attic ladder, a floating chest jammed it sideways and pinned the lower rung. Ruth saw the attic window open and close once through rain as Marta tried to force the frame. By the time 2 men reached the house with a hooked pole, the roof pitch had shifted and the window sat under running water. Her children waited at the cliff ledge wrapped in dry wool while the search line traced the current below. By noon, Hank marked her name among the lost with steady hand and no speech. Reverend Paul Whitfield spent the early hours moving between church and lower dwellings with a medicine case that belonged to Widow Carroll and a satchel of church records sealed in waxed cloth. He insisted both mattered because one preserved breath and the other preserved bonds, births, and burials that proved a town had continuity after disaster. Near 7 in the morning, he joined the final crossing group at the Belframe segment, where the rope ran taut above a channel newly cut through the graveyard fence. He passed the medicine case forward to Ruth, held the record satchel high with both hands, and took one more step toward the church path. A beam struck the lower post at that instant, jolting the line sideways. His footing failed on submerged stone. Josiah reached with the pole hook and caught coat fabric, but wet wool tore free under load. The satchel made sure. The Reverend did not. By mid-morning, desperation spread in forms less visible than collapsing walls. Men who had never asked anything of neighbors now asked for dry socks, for spoonfuls of broth, for one more blanket for a parent shivering under the overhang. Mothers counted children aloud each half hour, as if numbers could keep absence from returning. The old hierarchy dissolved not in argument but in thirst, cold and hunger measured by cup and sack. Those with saved trunks discovered trunks held little utility without dry fuel and coordinated distribution. Those who had mocked preparation queued in silence while Ruth and Caleb issued rations by household marks from Hank's board. No one argued when told to wait. The flood taught sequence with relentless authority. At 11:30, the rain slackened to a hard drizzle. Yet the current remained violent because what came downstream now was not local weather alone, but released mountain load from every tributary above Granite Falls. Hank sent 2 scouts by Upper Trail to confirm whether east dwellings still held stranded souls. They returned 40 minutes later with 6 survivors and 1 stretcher improvised from shutter planks. By noon, the measured rise reached 13 feet above the old spring mark. Supplies tightened. Hank broke the final salt pork crock, recalculated portions at 8 ounces per adult and 5 per child, and moved seed corn farther back to prevent accidental consumption. Survival required discipline beyond the first rescue hour. He enforced it without harshness and without exception. It was during that constrained noon, with smoke from the clay stove struggling in wet air and the 4-chamber floor slick from constant traffic, that Asa Kincaid climbed the lower ladder on shaking legs and stopped 2 rungs short of the ledge, as if unsure he retained the right to step onto ground secured by the man he had ridiculed in public. He had lost boots, coat, store, and ledgers. Mud marked him to the chest. One clerk supported him from below until Josiah hauled him the final distance by belt and arm. Around them stood families who had heard every insult of May and every pricing announcement of June. Asa tried to speak in the old mercantile cadence and failed. What came out first was a request stripped of all trade language. "My clerks are still at the Cooper shed roof. 2 cannot swim. I need your line there again." He swallowed river water and added more quietly, "I cannot reach them." Hank handed him a dry cup, waited until he drank, and asked only for count, position, and last sighting time. Asa answered, 3 clerks, 1 injured, seen 10 minutes prior against the shed vent. Hank nodded, turned to Caleb, and assigned the retrieval team at once with no mention of debt, apology, or the names once shouted from the hitching rail. The line went out again through rain and debris, and by the second pass all 3 clerks were brought up alive, one with a broken wrist splinted in cedar lath and cloth torn from Asa's own ruined vest. As afternoon leaned toward evening, Hank continued issuing flour, broth, and dry places by count, while Copper Creek endured the longest day in its memory, a day measured not by commerce or standing, but by rope knots, ration marks, and the stubborn labor of keeping one another alive. By dusk, the rain eased enough for voices to carry from anchor to anchor, and Hank used that narrow mercy to convert rescue into order. He pulled a slate from the 4-chamber wall, wrote household counts in chalk, and assigned each family one task before they took rest: melt water, dry wool, split kindling, scrub cups, hold children at the inner wall. Idleness bred fear, and fear made crowds dangerous. Work made a shelter behave like a town. He opened the upper chamber only halfway and taught while he issued, because instruction was now as necessary as flour. One by one, he showed how each sack had been brushed warm, not hot, with a blend of 5 pounds beeswax to 2 pounds rendered tallow, then cooled on line before a second seam was sewn in tarred linen. He held a cut corner up to lantern light so they could see how wax had penetrated the weave, but left fibers flexible enough to fold without cracking. He showed cedar slats set 1 inch above stone, drainage cuts angled outward, and clay seals pressed at door edges to turn seepage away. Ruth stood at his elbow with the tally board, repeating quantities in a clear voice, and Caleb measured issue by scale weight, so no hand could accuse another of favoritism. The contrast was severe and plain. $9 had leased the cliff strip. $11.80 had bought Hank's first wax, tar, and brush stock in April. 40 yards of canvas at 20 cents had cost $8 more. 6 kegs of nails, 2 locks, cedar slats, and iron bolts had brought his total outlay to just under $64 by his ledger. Kincaid Mercantile had held stock valued above $4,000 by Asa's own spring inventory. By nightfall, that inventory lay scattered from bank to cottonwood in broken crates and swelling cloth bales. Modest preparation endured. Expensive certainty did not. Through the night of June 17th, Hank rotated rope crews every 20 minutes as he had promised, and by first light on June 18th, the thermometer read 46 degrees with low cloud still trapped in the basin. The river no longer climbed, but it did not yet yield. Small rescue parties moved by handline to retrieve those marooned in upper rooms, and each return brought less cargo and more silence. Hank forbade scavenging runs for furniture, trunks, or trade goods until every known soul was accounted for. No one challenged that order after the morning count posted at the 4-chamber showed 289 souls sheltered, 43 souls on high roofs awaiting extraction, and 15 still unlocated in the flooded blocks. 3 days passed before the current dropped enough for controlled descent into Main Street. On June 21st, with the gauge at 7 feet above Old Spring Mark, Hank led the first return teams downhill with poles, ropes, and lime for marking unsafe foundations. He entered each structure by sequence, not by owner status. Kincaid's lot was tagged last in the commercial row because its rear ground had slumped and remained unstable. Asa accepted the decision without protest and joined the crew hauling splintered beams clear of the church path. He worked in borrowed boots and did not speak unless spoken to. The first outside contact arrived that same afternoon. The railroad agent came from the telegraph shack with confirmed notice that the Black Fork Bridge would not reopen before July, and that emergency freight could reach Copper Creek only by upland wagon from Granite Falls if roads held. Hank read the slip, pinned it beside his copied warnings from June 16th, and adjusted ration tables publicly. Flour dropped to 6 pounds weekly for 3-soul households, 9 for 5 souls, 15 for 8 with bean supplement doubled. Seed corn remained sealed and untouched. Eat now from what can be replaced, he told the line at dusk. Plant later from what cannot. By the second week of July, the reckoning began in the form Copper Creek could bear. Not speeches at first, but visits. Families climbed the ledge to return borrowed kettles, patched blankets, and lengths of rope cleaned and coiled. Many stood awkwardly at the threshold and repeated words they had once laughed at in the street. A carpenter named Owen Pike came with 2 repaired ladder rungs on his shoulder and said, "I told my boys your place was the Badger's Burrow. They shouted it after you. They repeated me. I was wrong in front of them, and they learned wrong from me." He set the rungs down, removed his hat, and asked if he could help rebuild the lower shelf to Hank's measurements. Hank handed him a rule and said the rise should be 7 feet clear, no less, because wet wool must hang without touching floor. Widow Carroll came next, carrying the medicine case Reverend Whitfield had saved and Ruth had kept dry in the chamber. She placed it on the plank and said she had laughed when Hank asked households to move oil and blankets above 20 feet, because she had trusted old marks carved into her cellar post more than the river itself. Her apology was simple and unadorned. Hank listened, asked after her cough, and instructed Caleb to issue her extra onion and salt for broth. Forgiveness in those days appeared as a practical adjustment entered on a ration board. Asa delayed longer than most. He worked rebuilding crews by day, slept in the church hall with clerks by night, and spent evenings drying what could be saved from his account books. The pages had fused in places, ink bled into margins, and liens were unreadable across whole seasons. On July 19th, after sundown, he climbed to the ledge carrying a tin box that had survived in the mercantile loft. Inside were promissory notes, debt chits, and store credit tallies, many still legible. He set the box between himself and Hank and said, in a voice stripped of any counter-authority, that he had profited while fear spread, doubled prices when freight failed, and mocked the labor that later fed his clerks. He asked what repayment could be made that would not insult the dead. Hank answered with a framework, not absolution. He said Elias Dunn, Marta Bell, and Reverend Whitfield were beyond repayment. He said debt language was the wrong language for what remained. Then he gave Asa terms for service to the living. Every household that had taken emergency rations would receive staple credit at pre-flood May prices through winter. No interest, no penalties. Every new build permit in town should include elevated storage above known floodline, measured and inspected before occupancy. Kincaid Mercantile, if rebuilt, would reserve one wall of open shelves for community emergency stock rotated by date and count, not by ability to pay at crisis hour. Asa accepted each term before Ruth, Caleb, and 2 miners who had witnessed the exchange. He signed the agreement in his own hand on a dry ledger leaf and asked the church clerk to copy it into public record. The public reckoning came 2 Sundays later on August 4th, in the churchyard, where silt still marked fence posts shoulder high. 311 souls stood in attendance by the deacon count, many in mended clothes, many under hats reshaped by water and heat. The service named the dead first. Elias Dunn's hammer, recovered downstream and cleaned of rust, rested on a plain board beside his widow. Marta Bell's children stood with Ruth and held the lockbox she had tried to save. Reverend Whitfield's record satchel, dried page by page over low coals, lay open to the birth and burial lines he had protected. After prayer, Asa stepped forward and repeated his own words from May in full, without softening. He said he had called the chambers Reynolds' Folly and had taught others to laugh. He said he had raised prices when scarcity began and had mistaken control for leadership. He said the flood took his store, but his greater loss had occurred earlier, when he refused to hear warning that did not flatter his standing. Then he turned toward Hank before the whole yard and asked whether forgiveness could be asked at all by a man whose choices had worsened hunger. Hank did not answer quickly, and the pause carried weight because it admitted the question's burden. When he spoke, his voice held no theater. He said forgiveness was smaller than the labor ahead and too easily used as a receipt to close a hard account. He said he would not issue receipts for grief. He said, "My mother taught me that preparation is duty owed to sleeping neighbors. My grandfather died proving the same truth in another valley. I did not build those chambers to win an argument. I built because water does not ask who mocked whom. If you would honor our dead, learn the method, teach it true, and keep it when years are dry and pride returns." That answer redirected the town more effectively than any pardon might have done. Beginning in mid-August, Hank held instruction afternoons twice weekly on the cliff. He charged nothing. Households brought their own sackcloth, tarred thread, and wax contributions when able. He taught seam spacing by finger width, clay seal consistency by touch, drainage grade by cup test, and storage rotation by date mark, cut into cedar strips. He made Ruth responsible for records and Caleb for tool maintenance, and both performed with sober competence that made adults stand straighter. By October 1889, 68 households had completed elevated caches inspected against a standard checklist posted at the church porch. The town moved itself physically as it learned. Rebuilt foundations sat higher by ordinance adopted on October 21st, minimum 3 feet above June's mapped inundation line, with loft access from interior and exterior both. Barns were required to keep one sealed grain reserve above ladder reach of standing water. New rope anchor points were set at 20-yard intervals from church to escarpment, each marked by red cloth lantern chimneys on storm days in memory of the first line. Kincaid Mercantile reopened in November on higher pilings with plain siding, smaller windows, and one entire wall labeled Community Reserve, where sacks were dated, waxed, and rotated under public view. Years later, Copper Creek speaks of 1889 not as the year one man was proven right, but as the year a town learned what respect for practical knowledge costs and what neglect costs more dearly. The cliff chambers still stand above the bend. Cedar slats have been replaced 3 times. Iron hasps have been changed twice. The measurements remain 8 by 5 by 7, with drainage cuts angled outward, exactly as Hank first carved them. Each April, new hands warm wax in cast kettles and brush sackcloth until it darkens amber in the light. In the present season, when spring rain begins and the river turns smooth after hard winter, the latter fills before dusk with mothers, miners, clerks, and children old enough to sew straight seams. They call the method by its earned name, not Reynolds' Folly. Reynolds' Method. On the inner lintel of the upper chamber, cut into stone by Ruth Bell in 1903 and recut by her grandson in 1931, the inscription remains clear: words do not stop water. work does. That inscription remained clear through soot, frost, and hands worn rough by labor. And on the first Monday of April 1932, with a dawn temperature of 37 degrees and river ice just broken along the bend, Hank stood beneath it while 23 townsfolk waited on the ladder for their turn at the upper chamber table. He was 77 then, narrower through the chest than he had been in 1889, his left hand stiff and cold from old rope strain, yet his voice still carried the same measured authority when he called out seam checks by order and weight. Ruth Bell, now Ruth Hale after her marriage and widowing, read from the tally slate, while Caleb Morrow, gray at the temples and broad as any teamster, held the scale beam level with 2 fingers and watched the needle settle before he spoke each number. Flour sacks entered at 50 pounds and left the brush bench at 51, and a quarter once waxed and stitched. Bean sacks entered at 30 and left at 31. Nothing was guessed. By midday, the chamber floor was lined with the exact items that had once meant the difference between life and ruin. 12 sacks flour, 9 sacks beans, 6 crocks salt pork, 4 crates dried apples, 3 lamp oil tins sealed with pitch cloth, 2 demijohns medicine alcohol wrapped in fresh straw rope, and a cedar box of boiled bandages folded in packets of 10. Hank made the youngest apprentices open 1 packet, inspect for mildew, and reseal with date notches cut on the edge. Seed corn from the old line, kept back each year from the best dry years, was weighed separately and entered under planting reserve. "This is not ration grain," he said, tapping the box lid once. "If hunger comes, we tighten belts and eat beans. We do not eat next year." No one challenged him. They had inherited memory as well as method. 3 days later, when the river held steady and the evening sky cleared hard blue over the escarpment, Copper Creek gathered in the rebuilt churchyard for the annual reading of losses and lessons, a practice first set in 1890 and never abandoned. The deacon count that year stood at 402 souls, with rail families and quarry workers added to the old mining corps, and every name was read from Reverend Whitfield's recovered record satchel before any hymn began. Elias Dunn, Marta Bell, Paul Whitfield. After the names, Ruth set Marta's oilcloth lockbox on the table and opened it before all, as she had done each year once her brothers reached adulthood. Inside were the same papers Marta had tried to save: birth lines, a deed copy, and 2 school certificates gone soft at the corners but still legible. The box was closed, wrapped, and returned to the family shelf. Memory remained practical in Copper Creek. It was handled, not merely spoken. At that same gathering, Asa Kincaid, 74 and walking with a hickory cane after a winter hip fracture, asked for the floor without ceremony. His mercantile had survived 3 ownership transfers after his retirement, yet he still carried the tone of a man who had learned that authority was lent, not owned. He set a tin case on the board table, opened it, and removed the final bundle of pre-flood debt chits he had kept as evidence of his old practices. The notes were the last physical remnant of the bargain he had made with Hank in July 1889. These were satisfied by labor, grain rotation and winter credits 30 years ago, he said, voice thin but steady. I kept them to remind myself how easily fear becomes profit when a man mistakes accounts for duty. He handed the bundle to Ruth, and she placed it in the stovepan beside the yard wall. Caleb lit it with 1 match. The chits curled black and became ash within a minute. No one applauded. The silence held respect, not spectacle. On June 17th of that year, 43 years to the day after the flood crest, Hank climbed to the upper chamber before sunrise and asked Caleb to bring down the old ledger chest from the rear shelf, where it had sat wrapped in oilcloth since the first rebuilding winter. Together they laid out each item and closed each old thread in writing while Ruth witnessed at the table. The telegraph slips from Granite Falls and Black Fork were copied into church record in 1890, and the originals had crumbled beyond handling by 1908. The soaked bell livery ledger, dried page by page over stove heat, had been recopied in full by Ruth in 1893 and then returned to her family. The medicine case saved by Whitfield remained in Widow Caro's line and was still stocked each spring by subscription. Elias Dunn's recovered hammer had passed to his daughter and then to her son, who still used it at the forge on River Road. Hank signed each note with a slow hand. He did not permit lore to replace documentation. If the method was to endure, details had to outlive witnesses. By the second week of September, after a summer of ordinary flow and one brief thunder rise, the county survey office sent a new stage report confirming Black Fork's stone piers had held 3 consecutive high water seasons and that emergency freight routes were now mapped for every settlement west of Granite Falls. The clerk read the report aloud at the store porch, then pinned a copy at the church and another at the Cliff Path entrance, where weather notices had hung since 1889. Hank read both and nodded once. External warning had failed them once by delay, but never again by neglect. In Copper Creek, every report was logged, copied, and acted upon by rule. That autumn brought the last private reckoning Hank ever accepted. Owen Pike, whose boys had once shouted the Badger's Burrow after their father's example, came to the ledge with those same boys now grown men, each carrying a finished wax brush and tar thread bundle made by hand. Owen said he had opened his mouth many times over 30 years, intending to ask forgiveness directly, and had never found words that did not sound like purchase. Hank listened, then moved the bundles to the teaching bench and set all 3 men to work sealing grain for 2 widowed households before night frost. He answered only when the final seam was complete. "If the boys learn better than they were first taught," he said, "then you have already done the part that mattered." Owen removed his hat and did not speak again. Some reckonings ended in speeches. Others ended in shared labor at a table worn smooth by use. Winter came hard in January 1933, with 11 nights below zero and drifts to fence height on the North Road. Yet no household in Copper Creek lost its reserve, because each cache was inspected in October, and again after the first deep freeze, exactly as Hank had required since the ordinance year. Kincaid Mercantile, now run by Asa's granddaughter Clara, posted weekly reserve counts beside sale prices and rotated emergency stock before private orders whenever transport lagged. The old line from the hitching rail survived in altered form. When a new family stored grain low and was corrected by a neighbor, the warning came plain and almost affectionate: "Build it Reynolds true, or do it twice in mud." In March, Hank fell ill with a chest infection that did not respond to mustard plasters, willow bark tea, or the physician from Silverton who arrived by sleigh on the 15th. He asked to be carried to the middle chamber on the 16th, where cedar held warmth and the stone kept the air even near 55 degrees, despite wind outside. Ruth and Caleb took turns at his bedside through the night. Near dawn, he asked for the tally slate and made one final correction to spring issue weights, reducing flour by half a pound for 2 sole households and increasing dried apples by 1 pound where children were present. "Practical to the end," Ruth said later. "Exact to the end," Caleb answered. Hank Reynolds died at sunrise on March the 17th, 1933, with the inscription above him and the ledger chest sealed at the foot of his cot. He was buried 3 days later on the church knoll beside those lost in the flood year, under a plain sandstone marker cut by Dunn's grandson at no charge. Asa Kincaid stood through the entire service in wind that made his cane tremble, and spoke only once, at the grave edge, saying to Ruth that he had been given more than forgiveness and had spent a lifetime trying to earn the difference. Ruth replied that earning was done in the present tense, not the past, and handed him the first spring inspection form for his signature. He signed it with care. The chambers still stand above Copper Creek. They are inspected each April by ordinance and by custom, and the latter is replaced before rot can argue with memory. Children are taught to read willow debris lines before they are taught account columns. Weather reports are copied twice and posted where everyone can see. In years of low water, no one calls caution weakness. In years of heavy snow, no one waits for the first cellar seep before moving stores uphill. The inscription remains clear because hands keep recutting its grooves when frost softens the edge. Words do not stop water. Work does.